They look at their risk, but when they look at that risk, they don't actually go, okay, so what is the knock-on impact of that, and what are the unintended consequences?
Obviously, March is a bad month with the Ever Given getting stuck, COVID, lockdown starting, war in Iran. It's going to be one of those sort of decades that you go, oh, beware the Ides of March.
If you can get your people to a point where they can respond to a small incident and do it confidently and come out at the end with positive results, you can then prepare them for the worst case scenario. But if you can't manage the small stuff, then you're never going to be able to manage the big stuff.
Hello and welcome to Being Crisis Prepared, the business continuity podcast from Inverroy Crisis Management. And today I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Su Sproston, our principal consultant at Inverroy Crisis Management. Sue, rather than me introduce you, could you say a few words to our listeners about your background and your role with the company?
Thanks, Matthew. So I've been with Inverroy just over a year. Time has flown by really quickly. Previously worked for BP in the crisis and continuity management team for over 25 years and have been part of and involved in major incidences across that time, supporting training teams. And so it's been a really interesting time because, no one incident is the same. Things will come at you sideways. So a really interesting career and one that I've absolutely loved.
Fascinating. So in that 25 years, just UK, or did that take you to all corners of the globe?
So it's taken me to all corners of the globe. I've visited so many countries and met some wonderful people, and everybody is very different and have different ways of thinking when it comes to incident response and management. And so it's aligning with what fits in with them and what is doable for them as well.
Yeah, and we'll probably come back to it given what's going on in the world at the moment. But on the major crisis side, would that have included Texas refinery or Macondo type activities?
Well, it's actually been quite a few, Matthew, even Russia, Ukraine.
Sorry, oversimplifying as ever. That's me.
No, it's been Russia, Ukraine, strikes and political unrest as well. So it's been very, very varied and just across the world as well, not just wildfires and earthquakes, spills. It's been very, really varied.
Okay, so hopefully that as we go into our chat, that we'll be able to draw on some of that information and that knowledge. Fascinating. So as our listeners will know, we normally start with a look at what's caught our eye in the news. There's clearly one very large story out there. This is being recorded on the 25th of March, 2026. But is there any aspect of that, Sue, that has caught your eye and you'd like to share with the listeners?
Yes, I think it is a hot topic, but we also need to think about the fact that there are other places very similar to the Straits of Hormuz that have either been impacted in the past. So if we look at the Panama Canal, for example, the Straits of Taiwan, there's been incidences of those from water shortages in the Panama Canal that stopped shipping. There was troubles in the Straits of Taiwan, and that could impact maritime shipping. If there's suddenly some problem there, that does impact the global maritime
so I guess
trade.
The closure of the Straits of Hormuz at the moment with US-Iran war is the current hot topic. But I read that it's the 5th anniversary, and I can't believe it's 5 years already since the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal. And that loss of global trade, I guess, is what we're talking about here. The loss of a key supplier, and that happens to be, in this current instance, is fuel, with 20% of the world's fuel going through the Straits. Without that, suddenly we've got to start thinking about at what point do communities, countries, run out of fuel, and that impact on everything from the ability to turn on the lights to running babies' incubators in hospitals. Because people often say, and it strikes me everywhere we go, they say, oh, we've got a backup generator. Yes, but if your backup generator also relies on diesel and you don't have any diesel,
Yep.
you don't have a backup generator. That sort of impact at the moment is massive, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest problem, is that sometimes I think organizations, they look at their risk, but when they look at that risk, they don't actually go, okay, so what is the knock-on impact of that, and what are the unintended consequences? So, I read today about the potential fuel rations in the Philippines and the knock-on effect that that's going to have. And even the airlines are talking about restricting flights and grounding aircraft. And the knock-on impact of that is, their economy gets knocked because they're not bringing in all the income on flights and tourists,
all those trade missions and tourists and
So I think that a lot of times, that we tend to be a bit blinkered in our thinking when we're talking about resilience. Organizations and governments and countries need to think about what is the knock-on impact of, to your point, around running generators at hospitals and that kind of thing. And if we can't have that, how are we going to do it? It's interesting.
Yeah, hopefully there's a few crisis and continuity managers at the moment that are, those who aren't already flat out dealing with the people issues of having offices in the Middle East, or all the travelers that were stuck in the wrong part of the world when airspaces closed down and major hubs closed at the start of this war. But now that hopefully people are more or less into a steady state rhythm of coordination meetings and crisis management meetings and so on, there is about to be an extra layer of complication on top of that as reserves are impacted, or just the simple impact of price increases. The UK talk of, is it $100 a barrel above or below? Well, I remember 2011 when it was $120 a barrel. And obviously, inflation and all the rest of it since then is probably the equivalent to $150 a barrel. The world didn't stop. So it is surprising how resilient we can be to these price shocks. But it does make it more difficult, especially when we're already still recovering from COVID, which rather scarily is 6 years ago this month that the Prime Minister told us all to stay at home. In fact, almost to the day that we're talking now. So it's obviously March is a bad month with the Ever Given getting stuck, COVID, lockdown starting, war in Iran. It's going to be one of those sort of decades that you go, oh, beware the Ides of March. The other article that caught my eye in the news is the fire at Glasgow Central Railway Station. That I appreciate, Sue, you're down in England and I'm recording this from Scotland. So you may not have seen it in quite the same way. But the fire started in a shop at the station, and the clear video footage shows someone trying to put it out with a fire extinguisher and smoke coming out of the shop. And in the 21st century, you would assume that fire systems would have put that out and it would have stayed within the shop and it wouldn't have spread. And yet, rather shockingly, 6 hours later, it looked like footage from the Second World War blitz of London, flames leaping up, buildings collapsing, really shocking footage. But the impact then is obviously the primary impact is on all the people who worked from those locations that are now a pile of rubble. But the secondary impact was interesting, that all the roads around it were closed. And I was talking to someone who was working in central Glasgow on the day after, on the Monday, and they said they had to close the office, despite the fact they were a couple of 100 meters away, because the smoke in their office was so bad that it was a breathing problem. And so so all that sort of idea of, oh, it's just a fire, it'll go out in a couple of minutes and everything will be fine. And we've got zonal sprinkler systems. And, so we just need to worry about changing allowing it to dry out, changing the carpets, laying some new cables, and we'll be back up and running, no problem at all. No. That is no longer, in my mind, a given, because the proof is Glasgow that, yes, in the ideal world, it gets put out. But what Lucy Easthope described at a conference I attended as the reasonable worst case scenario is that actually your fire could become a really bad issue, or someone else's fire that has nothing to do with you. So if you're above a shop that, a coffee shop that has a heating system, or a cafe that does bacon rolls or whatever, you might think, oh, how convenient, because I can nip down from a bacon roll. But what if that catches fire and then spreads down the street and everyone is impacted? Or 2 days later, you still can't get in because of smoke. I think the fire was on Sunday the 8th, and we're now the 25th. And there are still lots of roads in central Glasgow closed because the barriers are put up because demolition work is taking place. And it is a real eye-opener to fire is still a huge risk.
Yes.
And you of all people, I'm preaching to the choir,
No,
so please do say, no, Matthew, you're an idiot.
No, not at all. But I think there is, if we just look at the number of fires that have actually occurred across the UK over the last year, big businesses, houses, historic monuments, thatched roof cottages that have stood for much longer than wildfires.
Up in Scotland.
Up in Scotland, I think you just got to, sometimes you've got to just think of that reasonable worst case scenario, and around how, if something happened to someone else, how could that, to your point, if we had a fire in the shop next door, would that impact it? Could it impact us? What would that look like? And I think sometimes businesses tend to stay clear away from that because they don't want to think of potentially something that they don't think will happen. But you have to think about that, because if you don't, you're going to land up in the situation where, the Glasgow fire has put a lot of businesses and a lot of people who can no longer go to work because their businesses are not viable anymore. All of these things need to be thought about. Being reasonable, you can't plan for every scenario because otherwise you do your head in, but you've got to look at those, what is reasonable and what is likely and potentially could happen.
Yeah. And the idea of planning for any scenario, not every scenario, was a quote from Robbie McDonald, who is the emergency response manager for the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. Yeah. But that idea of, yes, there are some that you need a contingency plan for, like a fire plan. But actually, if you can deal with any response and you receive the information of what's happened, you do your assessment, you develop your response plan, you assess how effective that is, and you go into that sort of cycle of whether it be the plan, do, check, act sort of deeming cycle, or plan, do, assess, review that I saw the other week, which was resonated with me. That sort of ability to respond is what it's all about, isn't it?
Most definitely. And I think and I sometimes say to organizations, if you can get your people to a point where they can respond to a small incident and do it confidently and come out at the end with positive results, you can then prepare them, and they will then be prepared for the worst case scenario. But if you can't manage the small stuff, then you're never going to be able to manage the big stuff. And that's going to be the challenge.
Great analogy. And the small stuff, I guess you can do almost as a safety moment. At the start of any meeting that you have, you can say, if there was a fire here right now, what are we going to do? Which is the initial react phase. But then what are we going to do about it tomorrow? Which then gives you the business continuity of, well, we need to notify, supplies are going to be arriving at the warehouse and the warehouse is going to be locked. So, who do we notify? All that type of thinking. It's just a 5-minute discussion. But for those on our listeners who are managers, there is that great phrase of, if my boss is interested, then I am fascinated. So it only takes you as the person chairing the meeting or the head of the department to ask the question, and everyone else in the meeting is going to go, do you know what, next time I'm going to be prepared for this, and I'm going to read the plan to make sure that it's not me that's caught out. But on we mentioned at the start, your global experience of decades of doing this, for the major sort of strategic crisis potential event, is there a way of working that you've seen that works well, something that you would encourage our listeners to think about?
Yeah, so most definitely in my years with BP, we used the incident command system, which initially was developed in the United States for Pacific in terms of how they manage the emergency services. But it's progressed and it's morphed since then. I think it was started in the 70s. Sometimes for organizations, sometimes they steer away from incident command system training and exercising because they say, oh, it's a US thing. But I have seen the incident command system working exceptionally well across the globe in all different scenarios with different numbers of people. You don't have to have a major incident to implement an incident command management process or an incident command response, because it will work for small incidents right through to the big incidents. But I think where the big incidents stand out is because ICS is structured and it is very clear on deliverables and outcomes, your response is much more credible. It supports good decision making across for leaders. It makes sure that everyone is involved in the response, they understand what their role is. It's good for communication. It's good for liaison with stakeholders and government authorities. So it's very structured documentation and making sure that at the end of the response, you have all the paperwork required should there be, unfortunately, any litigation at the end of the day, which for a lot of these major incidences, they are.
It's the nature of the world, isn't it?
It's the nature of the world, but it's something that sometimes organizations don't think about. And even if you write something on a post-it note with regard to the response, that little post-it note could mean a huge amount to the organization later on. So I love ICS. I think it's a really good, I've seen it work. I've never seen it fail. Let's put it that way.
And it's that idea of scalability, isn't it? That's the bit that probably stands. Any system that you're going to use, you don't want to say, oh, this is a type 1 incident, and therefore I'm going to use this approach. Oh, now it's a bit bigger, so I now need to go into my other type of. It needs to be one trained methodology, language, lexicon of abbreviations and job titles and roles and responsibilities and all of that comes together. That if it becomes a bigger incident, well, you now say, okay, we now need to expand that section by a couple of people. Well, okay, that's doable. It's still the same way of speaking. I guess from a condo or the big incidences that you've been involved in, that idea of having a common language and approach across a business, a global business, means that you can seek support from other business units. And it's this, although one business unit might be, first language might be French and someone else's is Spanish and someone else's is English, or when they come together, they're speaking the same response language and it all dovetails together. And is that how one of the strengths?
That is, I think, probably the biggest strength that the ICS has is the fact that you can pull in people from other, as you say, other businesses. They can walk into the room and they know what's going on. They get the incident information. They understand what the incident is. They know where the response is at that time. And then they go into their role and they know what they have to do because they speak in the same ICS language. So it is to your point of you can pull in anybody. And the good thing is if you have stakeholders or government organizations or even competitors that use ICS as well, you can pull them in as well to support if you've got a major incident because they also understand it. So I think it's really, really important. And that was the one thing for Macondo that was brilliant, because all of these people could be rotated through the response. And they came in knowing exactly what they needed to do. Okay, they needed, updating on the information, but the actual physical response, and this is what I need to do, and this is where I know I fit into this response organization, is really, really powerful. And as you said, Matthew, ICS response can be used for a single individual who has unfortunately a fatality in an organization, with a small response team right through to Russia, Ukraine, to what I'm sure is being stood up around the world currently for Iran, will be lots of organizations that are standing up response teams based on the incident command system.
Yeah. Now, when you see some of the fires that have been caused by drone strikes on both sides,
Yes.
The damage that's caused doesn't matter whether it's one side or the other of a geographic boundary. The damage is still the same. The lives lost are still the same. People will still be there with stretchers and fire hoses,
Exactly.
and that's the better you can coordinate that response, the better the outcome is for those people on the ground who are putting out the fires, saving lives. And for the business, the fewer resources you're spending doing it, the quicker you're back up and running afterwards, because you've dealt with it efficiently and you've minimized the damage in the first place. And if you are looking at an insurance claim, the more likely you are to have your insurance claim paid out, because you've documented what you've done, you've made good decisions through shared situational awareness and all the rest of it. Why would you not want to think about a globally approved approach rather than make it up?
Exactly. Exactly. And I can always remember years ago, an old professor of mine, way back when I was young and good, he always said, you will be judged not on what you do, but on what you don't do. And that judgment will be negative, and I think that's the beauty of the incident command system, is the fact that it makes you think broadly and makes you do things that is to the benefit of the people that are being impacted by the incident, and making sure that you respond in the most credible way at the time based on the information that you have. So if somebody does judge you around, well, you didn't do that, you can say, well, I didn't do that because this was the information that we had at the time.
So you say incident command system. Are there different types of levels that one can use, or is it, from a training perspective, if people think, where do I get more information, is this something that is a do it once and then that's it for the rest of your life? What would you advise to develop it and then maintain that standard?
So yes, you would do the different levels of the incident command system training, and there's lots. You start right off at the introduction, and then you go through what we call ICS 300, which is talking about how do you respond, the response organization, how it's made up, the roles and responsibilities, how you go through the planning cycle of a ongoing response. And then there's different aspects of that branches off, where you look at sort of role-specific training. So the operations section, et cetera. But once you've done that, it's like anything, if you don't practice it, then you forget it. And it's not really like riding a bicycle. You'll still retain information, but if you don't carry on and exercise and upskill yourself and do refreshers, you won't keep up with the changes in response over the years. But you kind of lose your confidence a little bit. And what ICS does is, if you keep at it and you exercise and you coach people, because you've now got the experience in it, you lose your confidence. And then when you go into an incident, you start second guessing yourself. So it's not a once-off tick box, done it, move on.
I've seen several times people may have had the training, but when it comes to it, that nervousness of, is that my responsibility to activate the team now? Or do you really want me to press send on this email or this update? And that we may all have done some form of first aid training in our lives, whether it's in the boys brigade, scouts, cubs, whatever, all the way through to first aid at work. And you've done the course, but when it actually comes to doing CPR or a defib machine, that is a big emotional thing to do. And you go, well, I've done it on the resuscitated doll, but that's not the same thing as doing it for real. So the more familiarity you have and the practice, the more likely you're to get it right on the day.
Exactly.
Anyway, Sue, I'm conscious that we probably overstayed our time with the listeners and those that listen to us whilst walking the dog or driving to work. Hopefully that's about the right time length. So Sue, thank you very much indeed for your knowledge and wisdom that you've shared with us today, and best of luck with the rest of your journey with Inverroy. great
Yes.
to have you on board.
Great. Thanks,
Thanks.
Matthew.